So in this video, I'm going to now explain and show you what does dopamine detox do. So we have the brain here, and inside the brain we have different brain areas, right? We have the left hemisphere and we have the right hemisphere, but that doesn't matter. What matters is we have two systems, right? We have two brain areas. I mean, this is kind of a bad drawing, but you get the point. Now, there are multiple brain areas, but in terms of dopamine, we are specifically talking about this two. So we have the nucleus accumbens here, and we have the limbic system here, And whenever we feel pleasure, whenever the brain associates something with good, let's say hamburger equals good, the nucleus accumbens, so this area right here, releases dopamine. So this area here releases dopamine, and then the dopamine is released into the limbic system. So whenever I, let's say, eat a hamburger or do something which feels pleasurable, the dopamine will be released from the nucleus accumbens. So the nucleus accumbens, this brain area, will release dopamine into the limbic system. Now, where does the pleasure happen? Pleasure happens here in the limbic system. So we have dopamine release, which happens here, and we have the actual pleasure, which happens here. Now, why does this matter? Well, here you have synapses, right? So in the limbic system, you have synapses, you have neurons. In that neurons, you have a synapses. I mean, we have neurons inside here, and we have in each neuron we have a receptor. So we have the synapse, and we have the receptors like this. And here in the middle is dopamine, right? Here in the middle of those two synapses, there is dopamine, right? Which came from the nucleus accumbens. It was released from the nucleus accumbens. And then it came inside of this synapse. Now, what is pleasure? What is actually pleasure? Pleasure or motivation, which happen in the same brain area, which happen in the limbic system, they bind to the receptors. So the dopamine binds to the receptors inside here. It binds inside of a synapse. It binds to the receptors. So what happens when we overload on pleasure? When we do too much dopamine? When we release too much dopamine here? Well, what happens is now we overstimulate the receptors. They become oversaturated. They become overstimulated by the chemical called dopamine, and because of that overstimulation, the brain decides to downregulate them. So they just start to decrease, right? They start to downregulate in the brain, right? So instead of having, let's say, two, let's say three of these receptors, now we have only one, right? Or we have only two. Now, what happens with dopamine detox? When we do dopamine detox, we are reducing the activity of this entire thing, of this entire neuron. We are reducing its activity. And when we reduce the activity of that neuron, the receptors here will start to upregulate. So now we have, let's say, 5 receptors. Then we have 6. So the longer you do dopamine detox, the more receptors you are going to have. Therefore, the more sensitive you're going to be to pleasure or motivation, or we could say both. Now, What is here that people don't understand? Well, they don't understand. They think that they deplete dopamine when they sort of engage in too much activity. The dopamine is there's too much dopamine here in the synapse, but that's not actually the case. It's not about how much dopamine is here, but rather the activity of this entire thing, the actual activation of the neuron, the actual on off switch, right? Neuron can be either turned on or off. Dopamine can either bind or not. So let's say drugs that let's say antagonize these receptors are called antipsychotics. Now, I'm just using here as an example to illustrate that dopamine itself is not a problem. The problem becomes when the neurons are turned on all the time. They are turned on all the time. That's the problem. When the neurons are turned on for too long, then the brain says, "Hey, let's downregulate this thing here." Now they don't downregulate this entire neuron. What they downregulate is they downregulate just the receptor. Right? They downregulate. The brain says, "Hey, we have too much overstimulation here. Let's downregulate the receptors inside of that neuron so that we cannot so that we can achieve homeostasis." You see, the brain, or we could say the actual brain. I'm sorry, just the battery went off. You see, the brain always seeks homeostasis. The homeostasis essentially means balance. So it doesn't want too much of something and it doesn't want too little of something. So yeah, that's it pretty much. So you have any questions, make sure to ask me in the comment section so I'll be willing to answer them. See you.